He's telling the story of Nettie Combs, the woman who vanished in 1953 and wasn't found until 1993. For 40 years, everyone thought she was dead.
Kentucky Fury, Nettie Combs slaughtered 21 federal agents, then vanished for 40 years into the mountains. They called her the Fury of Pine Mountain, a woman who had done what no man in Appalachian history had accomplished, killed 21 federal agents in a single night of violence so complete that the government spent 40 years denying it had ever occurred. The official records claimed the agents had died in a training accident, their bodies consumed by fire that left nothing for families to bury. But the mountain people knew the truth. They whispered it around fires that burned low, spoke it in voices that carried no further than the walls that contained them. A woman named Nettie Combs had slaughtered every man who had participated in the murder of her family, and she had vanished into mountains that would not surrender her for 4 decades. This is the true story of the deadliest night in federal law enforcement history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Perry County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coalfields. During the volatile years of the early 1950s, when the federal government was expanding its reach into regions that had governed themselves since before the nation's founding. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since the Revolutionary War, who measured justice not by what courts decided, but by what conscience demanded. You see, in Perry County during the years of our story, the federal government had begun enforcing regulations that the mountain families considered illegitimate intrusions on traditions that had sustained them for generations. The moonshiners who had operated since the Revolution were being targeted with intensity that exceeded anything previous administrations had attempted. The raids were frequent and violent, conducted by agents who viewed the mountain people as criminals rather than citizens, who employed methods that the civilized world pretended did not exist within American borders. The woman at the center of our story was born Nettie Mae Combs in 1918, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where her family had lived since 1795. She had grown into a woman whose appearance deceived everyone who encountered her, whose small stature and gentle features concealed capabilities that would eventually shock a nation. She was 34 years old in the autumn of 1952, a wife and mother whose life was about to be destroyed by men who wore badges, but who had abandoned any claim to the authority those badges were supposed to represent. That's right. Nettie Combs stood only 5 feet 3 inches tall, had auburn hair that she wore in braids wrapped around her head, possessed eyes that were the deep brown of autumn leaves, and that seemed to hold knowledge that exceeded what her years should have provided. Her hands were small but strong, calloused from work that mountain women performed without complaint, capable of tasks that ranged from the delicate to the brutal, depending on what circumstances required. She had learned things from her grandmother that the modern world had forgotten, knowledge that had been passed from mother to daughter since before anyone could remember. She knew plants that healed and plants that killed, knew how to move through forest without leaving traces that any tracker could follow, knew techniques for survival that did not depend on tools or weapons that could be taken away. The knowledge lay dormant during the peaceful years of her marriage, but it remained available for circumstances that would justify its use. Her husband was named Ezekiel Combs, a man 10 years her senior, who had returned from the war with injuries that the Veterans Administration classified as minor, but that Nettie knew were slowly killing him. He had been gassed during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, had come home with lungs that would never fully recover, had built a life with Nettie despite limitations that his condition imposed. He operated a small still that produced whiskey for family use and occasional trade, a practice that his father had taught him and that Combses had maintained since before Kentucky was a state. Their children were the center of everything Nettie did. Elizabeth was 12 years old, a girl whose beauty was already evident and whose intelligence exceeded what the local school could nurture. Samuel was 10, a boy whose quiet nature concealed a mind that was constantly working, constantly observing, constantly learning things that he never spoke about, but that shaped his understanding of the world. Ruth was 7, the youngest, whose laughter filled the cabin with joy that made every hardship bearable. The family lived a life that asked nothing from the outside world except to be left alone, that was content with what the mountain provided, that found meaning in traditions that connected them to generations stretching back to the founding of the nation. They were not wealthy by any standard that the outside world would recognize, but they possessed something that wealth could not purchase, a completeness that came from belonging to each other and to the land that had sustained their family for over a century and a half. The trouble that would destroy this family began with a new federal enforcement initiative that targeted the Eastern Kentucky moonshine operations with intensity that exceeded anything previously attempted. A supervisor named Vernon Crawford had been assigned to lead operations in the region, a man whose ambition exceeded his judgment and whose cruelty exceeded both. Crawford had determined that breaking the moonshine culture required methods that previous administrators had been unwilling to employ. Crawford had identified the Combs operation as a priority target, not because it was significant, it was modest by any measure, but because Ezekiel had spoken publicly against the federal enforcement, had attended meetings where families discussed resistance, had become a symbol of defiance that Crawford determined to destroy. The supervisor understood that symbols mattered more than substance, that destroying Ezekiel Combs would send a message that resistance carried consequences that no family could afford to risk. The raid was planned for the night of October 15, 1952. Crawford selected 21 agents for the operation, far more than any legitimate enforcement action would require, a force that suggested intentions beyond mere arrest. The agents were told that the Combs family was dangerous, that Ezekiel had threatened violence against federal officers, that the operation required overwhelming force to ensure agent safety. The briefing was lies from beginning to end, manufactured justifications for what Crawford had actually planned. The family was gathered for supper when the agents arrived, a meal that Nettie had prepared from the garden's final harvest before winter closed in. Ezekiel sat at the head of the table, his breathing labored from lungs that the gas had damaged decades before. Elizabeth was helping Ruth with her food, patient with a younger sister whose coordination still required assistance. Samuel was quiet as always, eating with the methodical attention he brought to everything he did. Nettie heard them coming. The sounds of men moving through forest at night carried farther than those men imagined, reached ears that had been listening for danger since childhood. She looked at Ezekiel, saw in his eyes that he had heard them too, understood without words being exchanged that something terrible was approaching. "Take the children to the cellar," Ezekiel said, his voice steady despite what he knew was coming. "Whatever happens, keep them safe." Nettie gathered the children quickly, guided them to the root cellar beneath the cabin, promised them that everything would be fine, that their father would handle whatever was happening outside. The children descended into darkness that smelled of earth and stored vegetables, into a space that would become their tomb. The agents did not announce themselves, did not demand surrender, did not follow any procedure that legitimate law enforcement would require. They surrounded the cabin in positions that blocked any escape, set fires at multiple points simultaneously, created an inferno that would consume everything within minutes. Ezekiel emerged from the cabin with his hands raised, the universal gesture of surrender that civilized people recognized and respected. The agents shot him before he could speak, multiple rounds that struck his chest and dropped him in the doorway of the home where his children had been born. He fell backward into flames that were already consuming the structure, his body disappearing into fire that would leave nothing for burial. The cellar that should have protected the children became their death chamber. The space was approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, had been dug by Ezekiel's grandfather, and had served the family for 3 generations. The walls were packed earth reinforced with stones. The ceiling was supported by beams that Nettie's own father had replaced 20 years before. It was designed to preserve vegetables through winter and to protect the family during storms. It was not designed to protect against fire that consumed the structure above it. The fire burned hot and fast, fed by kerosene that the agents had brought specifically to ensure complete destruction. The flames consumed the cabin's wooden structure within minutes, created heat that radiated down through the floorboards that formed the cellar's ceiling. The children, huddled together in the darkness, felt the temperature rise before they understood what was happening. Elizabeth was the first to realize the danger. At 12, she was old enough to understand what fire meant, old enough to take charge when her parents were not present. She gathered Samuel and Ruth in the corner farthest from the trapdoor, positioned herself between them and the heat that was beginning to penetrate their refuge. "It's going to be okay," she told them, her voice steady despite fear that was building in her chest. "Mama will come for us. She always comes." But the trapdoor that should have provided escape was already blocked by debris that the fire had collapsed onto it. Elizabeth tried to push it open, found resistance that her strength could not overcome, felt heat that burned her hands through the wood that separated her from flames that were consuming everything above. The smoke came next. It seeped through cracks that should have been sealed, through gaps between stones that had seemed insignificant when the cellar was merely storing vegetables. The smoke filled the small space with terrifying speed, displaced air that the children needed to breathe, created darkness within darkness that their eyes could not penetrate. Ruth began to cough first, her small lungs unable to filter what they were inhaling. Samuel tried to cover her mouth with his shirt, tried to create a filter that might give her more time, but the smoke was too thick and his efforts were inadequate. Elizabeth pulled them both down to the floor, where the air was clearer, where they might survive longer before the smoke reached even this final refuge. "Mama!" Ruth cried, her voice breaking between coughs that racked her small body. "Mama, where are you? Mama!" The cry carried through the cellar, through the burning cabin, through air that the fire was consuming. Nettie heard it from her position behind the outhouse, heard her youngest calling for a mother who could not reach her. The sound was a knife that cut through everything, fear, shock, the paralysis of horror, and replaced it with pain that exceeded anything she had previously experienced. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, though Ruth could not hear her. "Mama's here. I'm coming. Hold on." But she could not come. The agents surrounded the cabin, were watching the fire they had set, were ensuring that no one escaped the inferno they had created. If Nettie emerged from concealment, she would die, and her death would not save the children whose lives were already beyond saving. Samuel stopped speaking first. The 10-year-old whose quiet nature had always concealed depths that his family was still discovering simply went silent, his lungs filling with smoke that his small body could not expel. He died holding Ruth's hand, died protecting his baby sister, as he had always protected her, died without making a sound because sound required air that the smoke had displaced. Elizabeth lasted longer. Her position near the floor gave her access to the last clean air in the cellar, extended her life by minutes that she spent holding siblings who had already stopped breathing. She felt Samuel go still, felt Ruth's hand relax its grip, understood that she was now alone in darkness that was becoming eternal. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silence of the cellar. "I'm sorry. I tried to keep them safe. I tried—" Her final words were a prayer that she had learned from Nettie, words that mothers had taught daughters since the family had first arrived in these mountains. She died speaking those words, died reaching toward a trapdoor that she could no longer see, died alone in a darkness that the fire above was illuminating with heat rather than light. Ruth was the last to lose consciousness, but Elizabeth was the last to die. The 7-year-old had simply stopped breathing first, her small lungs overwhelmed before the others. The order of their deaths would matter to Nettie for 40 years, would become something she thought about during nights when sleep would not come, would be recorded in journals that documented every detail of the tragedy that had transformed her. Nettie heard her children die, and something changed inside her that would not change back until 21 men were dead. The agents did not search for survivors with any thoroughness. They assumed that the entire family had been inside the cabin, that the fire they had set would eliminate any evidence of what had actually occurred. Crawford congratulated his men on a successful operation, filed reports that described a still explosion during a legitimate enforcement action, manufactured a narrative that would protect everyone involved from consequences that their actions deserved. They departed believing that the Combs family was extinct, that the symbol they had been sent to destroy had been destroyed, that no witness survived to contradict the official account. They did not understand that the most dangerous member of the family had not been inside the cabin, that she had witnessed everything they had done, that she would spend the following days preparing vengeance that would be complete regardless of what it cost her. Nettie returned to the ruins after the agents departed, sifted through ashes that were still hot from fires that had burned for hours. She found what remained of Ezekiel in the doorway where he had fallen, bones that the fire had not entirely consumed, fragments that she gathered with hands that no longer felt pain, because pain had been replaced by something colder. She found her children in the cellar, found 3 small forms huddled together in a corner, where they had sought safety that the smoke had not allowed them to reach. She buried them on a ridge overlooking the hollow where Combses had lived for over a century and a half, dug graves with her own hands because there was no one else to dig them, spoke words over each burial that combined prayer with promises that the people who heard them would not have wanted to hear. "I will kill them all," she said over the grave of Elizabeth, her firstborn, the daughter who had been beautiful and brilliant and who had died choking on smoke while calling for her mother. "I will find every man who was there tonight, and I will kill him, and I will make him understand what he did before he dies." "I will kill them all," she said, over the grave of Samuel, her son, the boy whose quiet nature had concealed depths that she would never now discover. "They will know fear before they die. They will know helplessness. They will know what it means to have no one coming to save them. I will kill them all," she said over the grave of Ruth, her baby, the 7-year-old whose laughter would never fill the cabin again. "They killed children. They burned children alive and called it law enforcement. They will learn what happens to men who murder children in these mountains." The transformation that followed was absolute. The woman who emerged from the burials was not the mother who had prepared supper for her family hours before. She was something else, something that the mountain had created from grief and fury, something that 21 federal agents would encounter before the month was over. Nettie spent 2 weeks preparing for what she intended to do. She gathered supplies from caches that her grandmother had shown her, locations where previous generations had hidden resources against times when hiding was necessary. She prepared compounds from plants whose properties she understood, created weapons from materials that the forest provided. She studied the agents who had participated in the murders, learned their names and faces and routines through observation that they never detected. She discovered where they were quartered, a facility on the outskirts of Hazard, where the federal task force had established its base of operations. The facility housed all 21 agents who had participated in the raid, kept them together in a location that Crawford had chosen for security, but that would prove to be the opposite. The attack came on the night of October 31st, 1952, Halloween night, a date that Nettie had chosen for reasons that combined the practical with the symbolic. The agents would be celebrating, would have consumed alcohol that their positions prohibited, but that enforcement among themselves was lax, would be less alert than duty required. Halloween was also a night when sounds carried differently, when screams might be attributed to celebration rather than violence, when darkness seemed darker and help seemed farther away. She approached the facility through terrain that the agents had not thought to secure, routes that required knowledge of the land that no outsider could possess. The federal compound occupied a former logging camp on the outskirts of Hazard, buildings that had been hastily converted to federal use and that had never been properly secured against threats that the agents did not expect. The perimeter was guarded, but the guards were accustomed to routine rather than danger, had grown complacent during weeks of operations that had encountered no resistance. She carried materials that she had prepared over the preceding weeks, compounds that her grandmother had taught her to create, and that she had refined for purposes that her grandmother had never imagined. Her pack contained enough to kill 50 men, though 21 would be sufficient. She carried a knife that had belonged to her father, a blade that had been used for practical purposes throughout her childhood, and that would serve a different purpose tonight. The first agent died without making a sound. His name was Thomas Whitaker, and he was 26 years old, and he had been present at the Combs cabin on the night when her family had died. He was a perimeter guard whose position had been compromised by boredom that caused him to follow patterns rather than vary his movements. Nettie had watched him for 3 nights, had learned that he always paused at the same tree to relieve himself at approximately the same time, had positioned herself accordingly. She approached from behind, covered his mouth with a hand that had held her children, and that now silenced the man who had helped kill them. The knife found the space between his ribs that her grandmother had described, the angle that reached the heart without encountering bone that might deflect the blade. Whitaker folded to the ground without any noise that would alert the others, without any sound except a sigh that might have been relief or might have been surrender. "For Elizabeth," Nettie whispered as she lowered his body to the ground. She was 12 years old. She tried to protect her brother and sister. She died calling for me. The second and third agents died similarly, perimeter positions eliminated with efficiency that would have impressed military professionals. Robert Callahan was 28, had been the agent who set the fire on the north side of the cabin. James Monroe was 32, had shot at Ezekiel's body after he fell, had ensured that the wounded man would not survive the flames that would consume him. Each died with Nettie's whispered words in their ears, with the names of her children forming the last sounds they would ever hear. Nettie moved through the darkness like she had been born in it, approached targets who never saw her coming, killed men who never understood what was happening until it was too late to respond. The skills that her grandmother had taught her for survival had been transformed into skills for killing, had proven equally effective at both purposes. The 4th through 8th agents were inside a building that served as their barracks, were celebrating Halloween with whiskey that their position prohibited, but that had become routine during their deployment. The celebration had been Crawford's idea, a reward for the successful operation at the Combs property, a recognition of work that he considered well done. The agents were loud and drunk and completely unprepared for what was approaching. Nettie sealed the exits, applying compounds to the doors that would prevent them from opening once the agents attempted to escape. She applied other compounds to the ventilation that would render them unconscious within minutes, mixtures that her grandmother had used to calm patients who required surgery that could not be performed while they were awake. The agents fell silent one by one as the compounds took effect, collapsed where they stood or sat, entered unconsciousness that they would not wake from as they expected. She entered after the sounds of movement had ceased, found 8 agents sprawled across the barracks in positions that suggested sudden collapse. Some had fallen with drinks still in their hands, had spilled whiskey that now mixed with drool that unconsciousness produced. Others had collapsed mid-conversation, had fallen against companions who had fallen at the same moment. None of them showed any awareness of what was happening as Nettie moved among them. She woke them individually, used compounds that counteracted the sedatives, ensured that each understood what was happening before she administered consequences that consciousness was required to fully experience. What she did inside that building would be detailed in journals that would not be discovered for 40 years. The deaths were not quick, were not meant to be quick. Each agent experienced consequences that matched the suffering that the Combs children had experienced in the cellar, that lasted minutes that felt like hours before release finally came. The first agent she woke was William Porter, 24 years old, the youngest of the group. His eyes opened to find Nettie's face inches from his own, to find himself bound in ways that prevented movement, to find a woman whose calm expression concealed fury that his comprehension could not contain. "My daughter Ruth was 7 years old," as Nettie told him, her voice carrying the steadiness of someone who had moved beyond emotion into something colder. "She died in a cellar calling for her mother. She coughed until she couldn't cough anymore. She was the baby of the family. She thought her mama would save her." Porter tried to speak, to beg, to offer explanations that might delay what was clearly coming. Nettie had no interest in his words. She had interest only in ensuring that he understood what he was experiencing and why, that he experienced helplessness, that her children had experienced, that his death would balance some fraction of the debt that he owed. The others watched while bound in positions that prevented them from looking away. Each saw what happened to Porter, understood that similar fates awaited them, experienced terror that mounted with each moment that the work continued. Some prayed, some wept, some simply stared at what was happening with expressions that showed minds retreating from reality that they could not accept. "My daughter Elizabeth was 12 years old," she told each agent as she worked. "She died in a cellar calling for her mother while smoke filled her lungs. My son Samuel was 10. He tried to protect his sisters while the air ran out. My daughter Ruth was 7. She was the last to die. I heard her crying until she couldn't cry anymore." The agents in the barracks died one by one while the others waited, knowing that their turns were coming, unable to prevent what the woman with the brown eyes and the steady hands had determined to accomplish. The screams that escaped before she silenced each one, did not carry beyond walls that contained sounds as effectively as they contained the agents themselves. The 9th through 15th agents were in a second building, an administrative structure where Crawford maintained his office and where several agents had been working late on reports that the raid on the Combs family had generated. Nettie sealed this building as she had sealed the barracks, applied the same compounds that had rendered the others unconscious, entered after silence had replaced the sounds of activity. Crawford was among this group, was the prize that Nettie had saved for special attention. She secured him last, ensured that he witnessed what happened to his men, that he understood that he would experience something worse before his own death finally came. "You ordered the raid," she told Crawford, as she worked on agents whose screams he was forced to hear. "You planned the fire. You told them to shoot my husband when he came out with his hands raised. You knew my children were in that cabin, and you burned it anyway. Now you understand what it means to watch people die while you can do nothing to help them." The 16th through 20th agents were scattered across the compound in positions that required Nettie to hunt them individually, that extended her night's work into hours that the facility's isolation made possible. Each one died after experiencing terror that the Combs children had experienced, after understanding that help was not coming, after learning what it meant to be helpless while someone with absolute power decided when and how death would arrive. Crawford was the 21st to die, the last and the worst. His death extended until dawn began to lighten the sky, until Nettie had extracted from him suffering that she considered adequate payment for what he had orchestrated. She left his body positioned in his office chair, left him facing paperwork that documented the raid on the Combs property, left him as a message that anyone who discovered the compound would understand. 21 federal agents killed in a single night by a woman who stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and who had never killed anyone before the month when her family had been murdered. The compound that had housed them became a morgue that the federal government would discover 3 days later and would spend decades trying to explain. The official story, the story that the government would maintain for 40 years, was that a training accident had occurred, that an explosion had killed the agents and that fire had consumed the evidence. The facility was demolished. The bodies were buried without the examinations that might have revealed what had actually happened. The records were sealed under classifications that prevented any investigation. But the mountain people knew. Word spread through networks that connected families across county lines, through whispers that carried truth, even when official sources carried lies. A woman named Nettie Combs had killed 21 federal agents who had murdered her family, and she had vanished into mountains that would protect her from consequences that the government would have imposed if it could have found her. Nettie Combs disappeared into the wilderness that had always been her home, and she did not emerge for 40 years. The mountains of eastern Kentucky became her sanctuary, terrain that she knew better than any map could document, that concealed her through decades of solitude that would have destroyed anyone with less purpose. She found a location that no search could discover, a cave system that her grandmother had shown her decades before, chambers deep within a ridge that had sheltered her ancestors during times when hiding was necessary. The caves had been used during the Civil War, had concealed family members from both armies that had swept through these mountains, taking whatever they could find. They had been used during the feuds, had provided refuge when violence made remaining in the open dangerous. They had been maintained across generations against the possibility that future circumstances would require what past circumstances had required. Nettie made her home in chambers that had been prepared by hands long dead, expanded the habitation over years of work that transformed refuge into something approaching comfort. The caves provided shelter from weather and concealment from any search, contained water that flowed year-round, and spaces large enough for the existence she would maintain for 4 decades. The main chamber she occupied was approximately 20 feet across, had a ceiling high enough to stand without stooping, received light from a crack in the rock above that served as both illumination and ventilation. Previous generations had improved the space, had built a stone platform for sleeping that raised occupants above the cold floor, had constructed shelves from flat rocks that provided storage for supplies and provisions. She built upon what her ancestors had created, added improvements that her circumstances required. She constructed a fire pit, that vented through natural fissures in the rock that allowed cooking and heating without producing smoke that might be visible from outside. She built storage spaces for the food she would need to survive winters that could last 5 months. She created a living space that was simple but adequate, that sustained existence without any contact with the world she had abandoned. She established gardens in clearings that the caves accessed, spaces where sunlight reached the ground, and where the soil could be improved through labor that her situation required. The first gardens failed almost entirely, planted in soil that proved too poor and in locations that received insufficient sunlight. She learned from the failures, identified better locations, amended soil with materials gathered from the forest floor. Each subsequent year produced better results as her understanding of the specific conditions deepened. Potatoes became her staple, hardy enough to survive the mountain conditions and nutritious enough to sustain her through winters when nothing else grew. She grew varieties that her grandmother had cultivated, seeds that she had gathered from the garden at her home before the fire had consumed it. Beans and squash provided variety. Herbs provided medicine and flavoring. Roots that grew wild in the forest supplemented what her gardens produced. She gathered plants that provided medicine and nutrition, accumulated knowledge that her grandmother had begun teaching her and that circumstances now required her to complete. She learned which plants treated infections and which ones reduced fever. She learned which bark could be boiled for tea that eased pain and which leaves could be applied to wounds to prevent complications. The knowledge that had been passed down through generations found its most complete expression in a woman who had no one to teach, but who documented everything in journals that would eventually preserve what she had learned. She trapped small game that provided protein, constructed snares and deadfalls that captured rabbits and squirrels, while she attended to other tasks. She learned the patterns of the animals that populated the ridges around her caves, identified the routes they traveled and the times they moved. The trapping became routine over years of practice, produced reliable harvests that sustained her through seasons when other food sources were scarce. She created systems that sustained her through seasons that varied in their generosity, developed routines that gave structure to days that might otherwise have been shapeless. She rose with the light that filtered through the crack in her ceiling, performed tasks that survival required, in sequences that became ritualized. The rituals provided meaning that isolation might otherwise have eroded, created rhythms that marked time, even when time seemed to have lost its relevance. The first years were consumed by grief that the campaign of killing had delayed but not eliminated. The fury that had sustained her through the night when 21 men died faded as months passed, was replaced by pain that she had not allowed herself to feel while vengeance remained incomplete. Now, with the killing done and nothing remaining to distract her, she mourned husband and children whose death she had witnessed, but whose loss she had not yet fully absorbed. The grief was physical, a weight that pressed down on her chest and made breathing difficult. She would lie on the stone platform that served as her bed and find herself unable to rise, would spend days in darkness that her fire had not dispelled because she lacked the will to maintain it. She would forget to eat, would ignore signals from a body that required sustenance, would drift toward death that grief made seem attractive. The first winter was the worst, a test of preparations that grief had compromised and of determination that seemed to have no remaining purpose. The cold penetrated even the cave, found her in the deepest chambers, demonstrated that survival in this location would require effort that her condition made almost impossible. She came close to dying multiple times during those months, from cold and from hunger and from despair that made continuation seem pointless. But spring came eventually, as spring always does, and with it came something that resembled the determination she had possessed before. Perhaps it was her children's voices in her mind, telling her that she had promised to remember them and that she could not remember if she was dead. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, the same quality that had allowed her to kill 21 men in a single night. Whatever its source, the determination returned, and with it returned the will to continue that survival required. She spoke to them constantly, held conversations with the dead that seemed as real as any she had held when they were alive. She described her days to Elizabeth, asked Samuel's opinion about decisions that survival required, sang lullabies to Ruth that the cave walls echoed back to her. The conversations might have been madness, but they sustained her through years when nothing else could have. "I killed them all," she told Elizabeth during one of these conversations, years into her isolation. "Every man who was there that night, they died understanding what they had done. They died knowing that their families would never learn what had really happened to them. I did that for you, for your brother, for your sister. I did it because it was the only thing I could do." She kept journals throughout her isolation, documented her days and thoughts in notebooks she made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals served multiple purposes. They provided activity that filled hours that might otherwise have been empty. They created records that would eventually explain what had happened and why. And they maintained connections to language and thought that pure solitude might otherwise have eroded. She wrote about her children constantly, preserved memories through descriptions that exceeded what photographs could have captured. She described Elizabeth's laugh, Samuel's thoughtful silences, Ruth's joy in simple things that adults had forgotten to appreciate. The writing kept them alive in ways that memory alone could not accomplish. Elizabeth would be 23 now, she wrote in an entry from 1963, 11 years into her isolation. She would have married, probably, would have had children of her own. Samuel would be 21, a man grown, perhaps working the land as his father worked it. Ruth would be 18, still young but becoming a woman. They would have had lives, they would have had futures, and now they have nothing except a mother who loved them and who did what love required when the world failed to protect them. She wrote about the killings with precision that would eventually provide answers to questions that investigators had never been permitted to ask. Each death was documented, each method was explained, each victim was identified with an account of what he had done to deserve what happened to him. The journals were a confession that Nettie intended to survive her, a truth that she believed the world should eventually know. The decades accumulated with rhythms that the seasons provided. She watched the world change from vantage points that allowed observation without detection. She saw roads improve and vehicles multiply, saw aircraft become common in skies that had been empty when her isolation began. She observed transformations that she could not participate in, watched a world move forward while she remained anchored to a past that the present had forgotten. By the 1990s, Nettie was in her 70s, had survived alone in the wilderness for 4 decades, had maintained her existence through skills that most people had forgotten were possible. The strength that had allowed her to kill 21 men in a single night had long since faded, replaced by adaptations that her intelligence devised and that her determination implemented. She knew that her time was ending. The body that had served her through decades of solitary existence was finally surrendering to age, that nothing could delay indefinitely. She prepared for death, as she had prepared for everything else, with practicality that did not exclude reflection, with acceptance that did not preclude the determination that had always characterized her. She wrote final entries in her journals, messages for whoever might eventually find her remains. She explained that the journals contained truth that she wanted known, that the deaths of 21 federal agents deserved explanation, that Ezekiel and Elizabeth and Samuel and Ruth Combs should be remembered alongside the vengeance that had answered their murders. Nettie Combs died in her cave on November 1st, 1992, 40 years to the day after she had killed 21 federal agents. She had positioned herself near the graves she had created for her family, markers that she had carved from stone and that she had visited every day that weather permitted. She died reaching toward those markers, died with her hand extended toward children she had outlived by 4 decades. Her body was found 6 months later by spelunkers who had ventured deeper into the cave system than anyone had explored in decades. They discovered the chambers she had made her home, the evidence of 40 years of solitary existence, the journals that documented everything. The murders of her family, the killings of 21 federal agents, the decades of isolation that had followed. The journals were initially suppressed by federal authorities who did not want their contents becoming public. But leaks occurred, information spread, and eventually the truth that Nettie had preserved became impossible to contain. The story she had told became part of the historical record, challenged official accounts that had been maintained for 4 decades, forced acknowledgement of what the federal government had denied since the night when 21 of its agents had died. The revelation produced headlines across the country. The story combined elements that fascinated the public: maternal vengeance, impossible survival, government cover-up, and truth that emerged only after everyone who might have been punished or vindicated was long dead. Investigators who examined the historical records discovered evidence that supported Nettie's account of what had been done to her family. Documents were found that confirmed Crawford's corruption, that confirmed the raid had been ordered despite knowledge that children were present, that the fire had been set deliberately rather than accidentally. The conspiracy that had murdered her family was exposed alongside the vengeance it had provoked. The descendants of the agents learned that their ancestors had participated in the murder of children, had burned a family alive, and had been killed in response by a mother whose grief had transformed into fury that exceeded anything any of them had imagined possible. Some families demanded accountability that no living person could provide. Others simply absorbed the truth, incorporated it into family histories that had contained gaps that now made terrible sense. Nettie was buried beside her family, in the graves she had tended for 40 years. The inscription on her stone reads, "Nettie May Combs, 1918-1992. They murdered her family." She answered. She waited 40 years. Together again at last. Beside her, the stones she had carved for the family she had avenged. Ezekiel Combs, 1908-1952. Husband and father, murdered by federal agents. Elizabeth Combs, 1940-1952. Beloved daughter, 12 years old. Samuel Combs, 1942-1952. Beloved son, 10 years old. Ruth Combs, 1945-1952. Beloved daughter, 7 years old. The songs that emerged from the Nettie Combs story were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of children dying in a burning cellar and the fury of a mother who killed 21 men in a single night. The first verse described the Combs family before the raid, the cabin where 4 children grew up, the life that violence would destroy. The melody was warm and protective, suggesting security that should have been sacred. The second verse described the raid, the fire, the children dying in the cellar, while their mother listened helplessly. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described Nettie's transformation, the mother who became something else as she buried her children on a ridge overlooking everything they had known. The melody grew cold and purposeful, suggesting fury that would not be denied. The fourth verse described the night of vengeance, 21 agents dying in a facility that became their tomb, Crawford dying last and worst. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting fate that moved through darkness without mercy. The fifth verse described the 40 years of hiding, the mother who became a ghost in caves that her grandmother had shown her, the children who remained alive in conversations that she maintained daily. The melody softened, became almost peaceful, suggesting existence that had found meaning in memory. The final verse described the discovery and the truth that emerged, the confession that challenged official accounts 4 decades old, the mother who rested at last beside children she had never stopped loving. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience, however painful, eventually receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Nettie rests beside the family she avenged, to read the inscriptions that list ages too young for stones to bear? Would you walk through the caves where she survived for 40 years? Would you try to understand how love and fury could sustain a life that had lost everything except the memory of what it had possessed? The journey to Perry County is easier now than it was in 1952, the roads paved, and the world more connected than it was when federal agents burned a family alive to make an example. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist in the evening shadows. The graves of mothers and children rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of Kentucky Fury, the woman named Nettie Combs, who slaughtered 21 federal agents and vanished for 40 years into the mountains. A story of love that became fury, that became decades of solitude, that ended only when death brought reunion that life had denied. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Nettie Combs killed 21 federal agents in a single night after they burned her husband and 3 children alive, then disappeared into caves for 40 years until her body was found with journals that explained everything. What about you? If federal agents burned your children alive in a cellar while you listened to them cry for help, could you kill 21 men in a single night and then disappear for 40 years? Could you maintain your sanity through decades of solitude, sustained only by conversations with children who existed only in your memory? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some mothers love their children so completely that 40 years of isolation is merely the space between murder and reunion. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the mothers who call them home.